Hello everyone, welcome back to the second class of this European project, Visual Thinking for Education. As you remember, this is the first module of 4 and it's called Philosophy in Everyday Life and the importance of its use in the arts, observing, asking questions, interacting and discovering. Today we are going to continue to talk about the implications between visual thinking and philosophy. But we're going to leave phenomenology behind, metaphorically, of course, and we are going to focus on the figure of Socrates and his peculiar philosophical method, which is based on a process of asking very challenging questions, I must say, in order to allow the interlocutor to give birth to their own truths. So let me start by telling you something about the figure of Socrates. Socrates is certainly one of the most influential figures in Western philosophy, both because of his unique character and because of the innovations that he brought to philosophy itself. Socrates was born in Athens during the 5th century BC, and that was a period of cultural, intellectual, and political activity, of a very impressive cultural, political, and intellectual activity. Um, Although Socrates didn't leave us any written works, his ideas, his life, and his method as well shaped shaped not only his students, especially Plato and Xenophon, but also the entire tradition of philosophy that followed from him. So to study Socrates is to study the figure of a person that combines together a stronger curiosity, a relentless questioning, and a form of moral seriousness. And all this, and this combination actually allows us to see how Socrates challenged traditional assumptions, the assumption that were traditional for his time, but at the same time, he continues to inspire critical thinking even today. But let's proceed one step at a time and let's describe in a little bit more details the Socrates' life. So, as we already said, Socrates was born during the 5th century BC, and this was a very thriving moment for Athens, which was called the Golden Age. Although Socrates was born during this very thriving period, as we said, where an impressive cultural, political, and intellectual activity characterized the city of Athens, he died, and so during the last time of his life, he experienced the declining period of Athens due to the defeat in the Peloponnesian War. But what we care most about is that Socrates' father was a sculptor and his mother was a midwife. Both played a very crucial part in Socrates' understanding of philosophy due to the metaphorical interpretation of their jobs. And we're going to see this, especially when we're going to talk about Socrates' philosophical method. In particular, it was his mother that played a crucial role by allowing Socrates to understand what he was doing in a different light, in a different way. Although Socrates didn't come from a very wealthy family, he certainly was a citizen of Athens, so he had access to the cultural and political life of the city. And he was educated following the traditional curriculum of that time. So he studied gymnastics, poetry, music, and so on. At the same time, Socrates had the possibility of meeting and encountering natural philosophy, which was the most popular trend of philosophy during that time. More specifically, natural philosophy was a particular type of investigation made by the so-called pre-Socratics, who centered around the study of nature, the study of the cosmos more generally, and the study of the underlying principles of the cosmos itself. Nonetheless, Socrates saw the limitations that were implied within this type of investigation, within this type of philosophical inquiry, and indeed radically criticized it. Because for him, this naturalistic type of investigation led to chaotic and confused conclusion about nature, so much so that the science of cosmos was inaccessible to human beings. And indeed, he claimed that those who devoted themselves to this type of science basically wasted their energy in attempting to have access to a science to which only the gods could have access. So you see here that Socrates was very harsh with these naturalistic philosophers because he thought that they were doing something that was just a waste of time, basically, a waste of their energy. They couldn't come to a good conclusion, and so they were wasting their time. Moreover, and that's the second critique that Socrates makes of these philosophers, these pre-Socratics, these philosophers were focusing on something that didn't matter so much. Because for Socrates, what mattered the most was human beings and human problems. And by focusing on nature, they were forgetting about what was the most important thing of all. Human beings, indeed. So Socrates shifted his attention inward, and he shifted his attention to human beings, inquiring solely about human values and asking people to understand what was justice, what was injustice, what was courage, what was cowardice, what was beauty, and what was ugly, and so on and so forth. Although Socrates is primarily remembered as a philosopher, and that's a good thing, Socrates also lived as an active participant in the city of Athens. He served in the military, like most of the male citizens during the time, and he fulfilled his duty with bravery, we can say. Indeed, he fought in several of the key battles of the Peloponnesian War, and he was described as during this battle as being remarkably resilient in the face of hardship. In particular, he was described as being able to endure hunger, to endure cold, to endure fatigue with an unusual composure. That is, he showed a very a great moral steadiness and physical toughness. Now, you must ask yourself, or you're probably asking yourself, why are we talking about Socrates' military career? What's the point here? And that's a good question. But I have an answer for you, because actually this Socrates' military career allow us to show something essential about his character. Why? Because although Socrates later on became a very harsh critic of the city of Athens and its values, it is also true that he never withdrew from his civic responsibilities and civic duties, and he actually was willing to risk his own life for the life of the city, for the well-being of the city of Athens. So you see here that Socrates was committed to Athens. He loved Athens very well. He was willing to risk everything for Athens, but at the same time, he also was a harsh critic of Athens and its values. And this shows us that Socrates had a very unique understanding of civic engagement and civic duty, a unique understanding according to which civic engagement extends beyond mere obedience to authority. Let me rephrase it in another way. For Socrates, a person, a citizen of a city, does not have to blindly follow the will of the majority and all the rules and laws that are made by oppressive rulers. A person, a citizen of, in this case, the greatest city of ancient Greece, shows his loyalty to the city where he lives by being loyal, first of all, to the higher standards of justice, truth, and goodness. So you can see here that Socrates didn't want to simply conform his behavior and his gestures and his comportment to what others told him it was right. He wanted to find what was right by himself, and he wanted to live in harmony with the higher standard of justice, truth, and goodness. So we can summarize what we have said by saying that Socrates embodied a sort of paradox, because on the one hand, he was a dutiful citizen, but on the other hand, it was a radical critique of Athenian society. On the one hand, he loved Athens, and he was loyal to Athens, but on the other hand, he also thought that being loyal to the city didn't mean to simply obey to the orders that were given to him, but involved devotion to truth, goodness, and justice. Now, Socrates' relentless questioning and his refusal to conform to the rules and the laws of oppressive rulers led to his trial and execution. So it was not very good for him. Like, this attitude actually didn't bring something very good to him. And indeed, in 399 BC, a group of citizens decided to bring formal charges against Socrates. And the accusations that were made against Socrates were twofold. On the one hand, Socrates was accused of impiety. That is, he was accused of not acknowledging the gods of the city of Athens and trying to introduce new gods. In particular, this accusation refers to the famous Socratic daimonion, which was actually a spiritual being that coincided with an inner voice, the voice of consciousness, we would say today. And Socrates talked about this voice as guiding his behavior and his actions. But we're going to talk about this inner voice later on. So we're just going to say two things here. The second accusation was the accusation of corruption. And indeed, Socrates was accused of trying to corrupt the youth by asking them to question and doubt traditional beliefs. That was a very strong accusation. These charges made against Socrates were not merely legal complaints, but actually they reflected a deeper unease within the Athenian society. Why? Because Athenian has just suffered a humiliating defeat in the Peloponnesian War. So every person, every unconventional figure, like the figure of Socrates, who was trying to elicit and cultivate critical thinking, was blamed for undermining civic unity and piety. During the trial, of course, Socrates defended himself, and we sort of have the recording of this defense in Plato's Apology. And he defended himself by saying, first of all, that he was not being accused of impiety, but he was actually accused of exposing the ignorance of influential citizens by his method of questioning everything. And so it was accused of embarrassing the most influential people of the city. And of course, they didn't like them. They didn't like that. Nonetheless, during his defense, Socrates defined his role and his practice of philosophy as a divine mission, as a mission that for him had a very profound and moral interpretation or understanding. But at the same time, and that's quite funny or ironic, Socrates compared himself to a gadfly. So on the one hand, he said, my mission is divine. It has a spiritual dimension and a spiritual meaning. But on the other hand, he compared himself and what he was doing to the work of a gadfly. And he said, and I quote, I am that gadfly which the god has attached to the state. And all day long and in all places, I am always fastening upon you, arousing and persuading and reproaching you. End of quotation. You see that this comparison is actually kind of unique and particular. Thus, Socrates, during his defense, emphasized how his approach, how his method of teaching philosophy was actually beneficial for the citizen of Athens, because he allowed, this method allowed him to show how people, and the citizen of Athens in this case, should care less about wealth, reputation, physical strength, and honor, and should care more about virtue and justice. As he declared in the Apology, I shall obey the god rather than you. And while I have life and strength, I shall never cease from the practice and teaching of philosophy. Now, you can see that instead of pledging for mercy and instead of recognizing himself as guilty, Socrates doubled down on his ideas and his mission as a divine mission. And so you can expect that the trial didn't go as well. Indeed, the jury found him guilty, and actually he was sentenced to, his sentence was even harsher because he didn't show any contrition. He didn't show any contrition. He didn't show himself as being sorry for what he did. And so the sentence that was decided against him was actually harsher. Indeed, he was sentenced to death, and he was sentenced to drink, condemned to drink a cup of poison. Yet, Socrates accepted this verdict with calmness and with dignity, insisting that for him, at least, abandoning his philosophical life and abandoning philosophy in general would have been the worst, because it would have meant betraying his deepest convictions, his deepest ideas, deepest values, and deepest principles. So for him, it was not worth it in the end. Betraying himself, betraying his principle was not good. He preferred to die instead of betraying his ideals. In Plato's Phaedo, which is one of the most famous dialogues that Plato wrote, and Plato was a student of Socrates, as we said, Plato offers us a very touching and moving account of Socrates' final hours, where Socrates is seen discussing about the immortality of the soul with his friends. And you can see here that Socrates, even during his last moments, never stopped to philosophize, never stopped to deeply care about philosophy. And even at this time, he showed a very we can say, particular attitude toward death, because he showed composure and he showed even humor in the face of death. Now, Socrates' attitude toward death and his acceptance of his death sentence solidified his reputation as a man of principle, willing to die for justice and truth. And this is something, this is a lesson that we can all learn, I think, that the ideals that we have sometimes are worth fighting for. Okay, now that we know some information about Socrates' life, we can move on to his philosophical principle. Unlike later philosophers who founded schools of philosophy and wrote systematic treatises, Socrates never produced any written works. And so we don't have anything written by Socrates. What we know about his life, about his ideas, about his philosophy comes primarily from other sources, especially Plato, Xenophon, and Aristophanes. Each of these sources, however, portrays Socrates from a different point of view, from a different perspective. Plato's, for instance, idealized Socrates. Of course, he was his master, his guide, his philosophical guide, and so he presented him as a profound thinker and a model for the philosophical way of living. On the other hand, Xenophon portrayed Socrates as a man of practical wisdom, while Aristophanes actually was the meanest one, because he actually mocked Socrates, depicting him as as a sophist who corrupted the youth. So in this case, Aristophanes agreed with the accusations that were made against Socrates in the trial, during the trial. However, these very differing accounts make the project of reconstructing the historical figure of Socrates a little bit challenging. They all agree in portraying Socrates as a controversial and provocative figure of his time. So for all of them, they all agree in saying that Socrates was a provocative and very controversial figure during his period and his time. Moreover, they all agree in saying that Socrates transformed the philosophical inquiry. And it transformed philosophy from an inquiry about nature into an investigation about human beings and the human condition. In particular, Plato and Xenophon, they allow us to reconstruct a figure of Socrates as a man devoted to examining life, to examining human life, a man devoted to the practice of critical thinking, that is, to teach to his students how to be able to critically reflect about what was taught by them, by the traditional upbringing that they underwent, but also as a man devoted to philosophy as a practical way of living. So for Socrates, philosophy was not a set of abstract theories, but was actually something very concrete, something that needed to be embodied, because philosophy was a way of living, a way of life. And we have already heard this sort of like a critique of philosophy as simply a set of abstract theories when we talked about phenomenology. Here we have a concrete example of a person who embodied this conception of philosophy. Now, in this new understanding of philosophy as something that we should live, as a way of life, one of Socrates' most significant contribution was certainly the idea of the soul, psyche, in Greek, which is viewed by Socrates as the true essence of human beings. So if we were to ask Socrates, if we could ask Socrates, what's the essence of human beings? What defines human beings? Socrates would answer us, what defines human beings is their soul, is the soul. So the soul is the true essence of human beings. In other words, for Socrates, the soul is the thinking and operative consciousness that guides the actions and the behaviors of humans, of a person, and so it coincides with the conscious I. Unlike the body, which is perishable and subjected to change, subjected to physical needs, basically, and that thus it's always changing, it's always moving, it does not remain the same. The soul is something unchanging, it's something stable, it's something that remains identical with itself. And that's the reason why for Socrates the soul must be the true essence, the true core of human beings. And as we just said, this soul coincides with the seat of reason, the seat of character, the seat of consciousness. Now, clearly, given this status of the soul as the essence of human beings, what truly defines them, what truly defines their worth, is not wealth, is not reputation, is not honor, is not physical strength, but it is the state of their soul. A person's worth, in other words, must not be measured, cannot be measured by external achievements or social recognition, but must be measured by how much effort a person puts into the project of cultivating virtue and justice. It doesn't matter the results. The results are not so important for Socrates. What matters is how much effort, how much time, and how much energy a person puts into the work of cultivating the virtue, cultivating virtues in general, and justice, but also wisdom, and so on and so forth. In this sense, Socrates actually even says that social recognition and material or external success or achievements can be harmful to a person because they might distract that person from their moral development. And so actually focusing too much or just simply focusing on external achievements is not simply something to be avoided, but can also be very harmful. So it needs to be avoided by human beings. This injunction, according to which we must avoid material success and social recognition, reflects a central principle of Socrates' philosophy, which I'm going to just name it to you and we're going to explain it in a little bit. And this principle is the following one. Caring for the self, to care for the self, is the highest human duty. Human beings should first of all and foremost care about their soul. That's the most important thing that they can do. Now, closely related to this idea and view of the soul is Socrates' belief in the existence of the daimonion, of an inner daimonion that worked as a divine sign. Unlike the traditional gods of the city of Athens, but of the ancient Greece in general, which were external gods, having the same characteristics of human beings, but still external gods. This God is actually an inner, it's inside Socrates himself. So it's an inner voice, it's an inner God that guides Socrates' behavior by warning him. And that's something very particular because according to Socrates' testimony, this inner voice, this inner warnings does not act, does not urge him to do something. So it doesn't tell Socrates, do this, do that. But actually, this voice, this inner voice works by warning Socrates and restraining Socrates from doing something, from making certain choices that might clearly be unjust, or acting in a certain way that is clearly unjust. And it is in the Apology that Socrates described at length this inner voice, this divine sign that he hears in his conscience, and that it has accompanied him since he was a child. And so I want to read to you the passage because I think it is very beautiful. Remember that this description was made in front of the Athenian jury. So let me begin. Perhaps then it might seem to be strange that I do go around counseling these things and being a busybody in private, but that in public I do not dare to go up before your multitude to console the city. The cause of this is what you have heard me speak of many times and in many places, that something divine and demonic comes to me, a voice, which of course is also what Meletus wrote about in the indictment, making a comedy over it. This is something which began for me in childhood. A sort of voice comes, and whenever it comes, it always turns me away from whatever I am about to do, but never turns me forward. You see here the key part. The voice turns Socrates away from whatever he is about to do, but never turns him forward. This is what opposes my political activity, and its opposition seems to me altogether noble. For now, well, men of Athens, if I had long ago attempted to be politically active, I would long ago have perished, and I would have benefited neither you nor myself. You see here that in this case, the voice prevented Socrates from entering the political career and the political activity in the city of Athens. And he is regarding this advice that the voice gave him as a very good advice, because he said, if I didn't have the voices stopping me, then I would have perished long ago. I wouldn't have survived this long. But what is important to note is that for Socrates, the daimonion is the concrete proof of a deeper spiritual dimension within human life. And this voice also suggests how moral awareness is not a matter of social conventions. It's not a matter of obeying and conforming to social rules, but it actually has a critical dimension attached to it, and that's very, very important. These two ideas, that is the idea of the soul and the guiding principle of the daimonion, allow us to start to recognize and to show concretely, actually, how philosophy for Socrates is not an abstract intellectual work. It's not merely, an abstract intellectual work, because philosophy has to do with the personal and existential dimension of human beings, and philosophy wants to cultivate this dimension for the sake of the good life, in order to allow people to attain happiness. And so you see here that the task of philosophy for Socrates is not simply to reflect on different kind of topics, but the task of philosophy is actually to care for the soul and to live in harmony with one's ideal of justice, truth, and goodness. And that's what we're going to talk about next. That is, we're going to talk about this task of philosophy. We're going to delve deep into this task of philosophy. So, if the self is the soul, is the true self, is the true essence of human beings, then caring for the soul becomes the highest duty of human beings, the most important job that they can do. In Greek, the expression "care for the soul" is said epimeleia e autou. And that's a very particular and interesting expression that we don't have time to analyze. But that's the expression that they use to signify and to convey the idea of caring for the self. Now, the cultivation of the soul for Socrates is not an abstract activity, and is not an abstract and theoretical task. That's not the point for Socrates. Caring for the soul is actually something very concrete, something very practical. It is the practical foundation of the good life, of a well-lived life. Thus, it has to combine together both an ethical and an intellectual dimension. According to Socrates, those who neglected the care of the soul, that is, neglected cultivating virtue, justice, wisdom, harmony with one's soul, and so on and so forth, they actually were falling prey of a very hard and very bad mistake, because they were misdirecting their efforts, they were misdirecting their life. And so in the Apology, Socrates tries, for instance, to convince the citizens of Athens to reconsider their priorities, and he does so by saying, and I quote, you are the citizen of the greatest city, renowned for wisdom and strength. Yet, are you not ashamed of caring for money and reputation and honor, and caring so little for wisdom and truth and the base state of the soul? You see that this statement encapsulates the central principle of the Socratic philosophy, or at least one of the central principles of Socratic philosophy, as we have just said, that external success, social recognition, is meaningless without the cultivation of inner virtue and justice. We should not care so much about wealth, about reputation, about physical strength, and so on and so forth, because they don't make us happy. That's the key point for Socrates. physical strength, external success, social recognition, they could never make us happy and virtuous. Socrates even says that even the most admired citizens and the wealthiest individual are unhappy and spiritually poor or impoverished if they neglect their soul. So you can see here that the key point is that for Socrates, happiness is something that we have full control of. Happiness is something that is being completely internalized. Happiness takes place within human soul. It's not external to us. Nothing that comes from the outside can make us happy. Only what comes from the inside can make us happy. And similarly, unhappiness is something that we have full control on. It's something that entirely depends upon us. It's not something that comes from the outside, but something that entirely depends upon ourselves. And so, for instance, we cannot blame others for bringing the greatest harm upon ourselves, because it's only us that can bring the greatest harm to ourselves. Clearly, by urging his fellow Athenians to focus on what really matters, that is the soul and the cultivation of virtues and justice and wisdom, etc., Socrates challenged the common assumptions of his time. And he also prompted his fellow citizens to rethink about their priorities, about human priorities. But you can see here that the priorities for Socrates needed to be shifted, and the citizen, people, should have recognized how the soul is the most important thing, and is certainly more important than the body and the external things. As a consequence, the cultivation of the soul becomes both an ethical and a philosophical project, as I told you already. It becomes a lifelong process of self-examination, reflection, and conscious decision making. This means that caring for the soul cannot be limited, cannot be restricted to an intellectual task. It cannot be restricted to self-interest and introspection. Yes, introspection, self-interest are fundamental. They're very, very important, because to train oneself and to demonstrate this rigorous and disciplined attention to one's thought, one's actions, one's desires, one's values, and so on, it's really important. It's fundamental, but it's not enough for Socrates, because caring for the soul also means that we have to actively shape ourselves. We have to actively engage with ourselves, and we have to refashion how we behave, how we act, how we comport ourselves toward the world and others. So you see here that there are two fundamental dimensions that cannot be separated, separated one from the other. But that's not all, because there's also another thing that it's really important to say. Caring for the soul is definitely and certainly a personal, an individual, and an existential experience. So caring for the soul has an existential and personal dimension. But for Socrates, caring for the soul must also have a political and relational dimension. The two cannot be separated. So when I cultivate my soul, I'm not doing that just to help me, but I'm doing that also to be a better citizen. I'm doing that to be able to contribute to the good of the community, because an examined and disciplined soul is less likely to harm others and to act unjustly, and so to harm the community which is part of. Okay, so we said that there are two dimensions that sort of like compose the project of caring for the soul. Actually, we can say there are three dimensions: the ethical and the intellectual dimension, and then there's the relational dimension. But I want to delve deep into the ethical and the ethical and the intellectual dimension of the project of caring for the soul in an individual sense right now. As we have just seen, the first step, the first part, the first element of caring for the soul is the principle of reflecting upon ourselves, is this rigorous self-examination, so much so that Socrates declared that the unexamined life is not worth living. Now, the principle, therefore, of knowing oneself, the principle of self-knowledge, is the first fundamental enactment of the care of the self. And this principle is expressed by the Greek maxim, Gnoti Seuton, which is translated into English as know thyself. This is not, for Socrates, this is not a philosophical slogan, but as I told you, it's a fundamental principle that allows us to enact the project of caring for the self. Now, the meaning of self-knowledge, or know thyself, is, for Socrates at least, that we need to recognize our own limits, and we need to confront with honesty and humility our own ignorance. So the idea of knowing oneself means that we need to become aware of the limits of our own knowledge. We need to become aware that we do not know everything, and we need to face and confront our own ignorance with humility and with honesty. We shouldn't be afraid of admitting and recognizing that we are ignorant. Now, this idea, for which knowing oneself is to know how little we know, is clearly connected to one of Socrates' most famous expression, which is, I know that I know nothing. You can see here that the expression, I know that I know nothing, clearly emphasizes the idea of having a humble attitude, of bringing forth an attitude of epistemic, at least, humility. We must be humble, because true knowledge does not believe in the claim that I know everything, or more easily that I know something, but true knowledge is connected with the recognition of the boundaries of what we know. By admitting our ignorance, therefore, we are not doing something absurd or something crazy, but we're actually opening ourselves to the world, and we are embarking on a path of inquiry, on a path of self-examination, and on a path of discovering what is outside of us, what is in us. And so you can see here that the formula, know thyself, and I know that I don't know, that I know nothing, these two formula, they have both a methodological and a moral function, which are very, very important. The methodological function is that they encourage the process of the practice of asking questions and creating dialogues, because these are viewed as living tools of uncovering the truth. But at the same time, they have a moral meaning, a moral dimension, because they foster a humble attitude, a humble behavior, because they foster self-awareness and vigilance, and they sort of like warn us against arrogance, which for Socrates is sort of like the worst. Don't be arrogant. That's the worst that you can do. However, as we have just pointed out, self-knowledge is only the first part of the practice of caring for the soul. The second one is the ethical part, because knowing oneself is not enough, as I told you. So, of course, one has to reflect on their actions, desires, and thoughts, but one also has to change his attitude, change his behavior. One has to shape himself, shape his soul, shape what he does, how he acts, and what he thinks. And that's really, really important. So the self you see here is like a work of art. The soul, our soul, should be conceived as a work of art that can be cultivated through the practice of different exercises. These exercises include daily practices of self-discipline, like setting aside time for meditation or writing a diary, but also rehearsing virtuous responses, virtuous actions, so as to sort of like habituate ourselves, get used to being virtuous. Sorry, I made a very loud noise. And finally, this exercise involved also testing one's attachment to, I don't know, objects, other persons, and so on. At the same time, this exercise can also involve the cultivation of habits, of different kinds of habits. Specific, maybe habits of attention can be a good example here. For instance, learning to pause before reacting to an offense or a challenge, question the impulses that we have to do things, and redirect our own desires based on what we care the most. So to summarize what has been said, Socrates develops the practice of caring for the soul. This practice has two fundamental dimensions, an ethical dimension and a cognitive or intellectual dimension. At the same time, the practice of caring for the soul is not simply a personal and it's not something simply personal and existential. It also has a political dimension encompassed within it, which is very, very important for Socrates. When we cultivate ourselves, we can also contribute to the good of the community, and that's something we should always strive for. Okay, so I have explained to you Socrates' understanding of philosophy and some of his most interesting and insightful ideas. Now we need to delve deep into his method of teaching philosophy to various students, which is also his method of teaching about self-examination, which is the part that presents the most significant and crucial connections with visual thinking, as we will see later on. Now, Socrates' new philosophical method emphasized dialogue, emphasized questioning, emphasized critical reflection over the memorization of abstract theories and ready-made doctrines. Such a method, which will be later known as the Socratic method, or also called Elenchus, is directed or aims at awakening self-knowledge, self-awareness into students. So that's the key task, is the students become aware of what they know, aware of their ideas, aware of themselves. By asking probing questions, what Socrates is trying to do is to show people that they believe they knew, for instance, what courage was, what justice was, what beauty was, what virtue was, but indeed they did not know it. So the idea is that questions allowed Socrates to expose the contradictions of his interlocutor, and so to show that they actually were ignorant about a particular topic that they thought they knew. Needless to say, this type of practice is very uncomfortable and unsettling because people need to face their limitation, and that's not something we like to do most of the time. Sometimes maybe. However, this practice served a higher purpose. That is the purpose of producing a greater clarity and an attitude of humility within the students or the interlocutors of Socrates. So you see here that, yes, the method is unsettling, but it's also beneficial. It depends on us whether we prefer to see the unsettling part or the beneficial part. To Socrates, and I'm going to just repeat it because I think it's really important, genuine wisdom does not consist in possessing ready-made theories, ready-made ideas, ready-made answer, but the genuine wisdom is actually connected with the possibility of recognizing the depth of one's ignorance and remaining open to truth as a process. So we can say that we are wisdom. We can say that we want to achieve wisdom when we recognize our ignorance and therefore remain open to truth as a process that is done collectively, that is done together. But let us proceed slower, a little bit slower, and let us start by saying something more general, very general about the Socratic method, by contrasting it to the sophist method. And I'm going to explain to you who the sophists are in 1 second. After that, we are going to look at the two moments that make up the Socratic method. Now, the sophists were itinerant teachers in ancient Greece, and they claimed to be able to provide young citizens with an education in rhetoric, public speeches, and public skills and political skills, so that they could have success in civic and political life. The sophists often charged their students with fees. This might be something normal to you, but it wasn't that normal during the time that we're talking about. And indeed, they were called the prostitute of knowledge and the prostitute of philosophy, because the idea, the dominant idea during the time was that teaching, and in particular teaching philosophy, was an activity that was made for the sake of doing it, for the love of doing it. So philosophy and teaching were disinterested activity that were done because people simply loved doing that. By asking money, by charging a fee for what they were doing, the sophists were going against these very radical idea that was embedded in the society they lived in. So they asked for fees. They asked their students for fees, and they were criticized for it. And their teachings, at the same time, emphasized persuasion and the appearance of knowledge rather than the pursuit of objective truths. So you see here that, as a consequence, the teachings that the sophists made were very pragmatic, and they were focused on how to win arguments and how to achieve personal advantage. That was the key point of the teachings of the sophists, because what they cared about was to provide success, public and political success, to their students. This means that the sophist methods of teaching consisted in proposing very elaborate display speeches, which were monologues most of the times, to their students. And these monologues, these display speeches, were full of very complex logical arguments, many references to traditional poets, and they were also very sophisticated. So they had a very elegant and sophisticated style. Clearly, these speeches were rhetorically impressive. So the audience, when it was hearing one of these speeches, was like, "Wow!" That was the sort of like reaction, because they were so beautiful, so impressive, so elegant. But they were also very superficial, because the only point of these speeches was to win over the audience. It was to win arguments. It was not the pursuit of truth, of objective and universal truth. You can see here that there is a distance, an immense distance, an irreconcilable distance with Socrates, because for Socrates, the purpose of teaching was completely different. It was not to win arguments, but it was to discover objective, universal truths that coincided with the standards of justice, truth, goodness, wisdom, virtue, and so on and so forth. So instead of emphasizing the appearance of knowledge, or emphasizing the need of persuasion, the art of persuading others, what Socrates was trying to do was to emphasize an ethical reflection, self-knowledge, and the search for radical and objective truth that were not, of course, superficial. Moreover, in contrast to the sophists, who used monologues to teach others, So that the sophists prepared some very elaborated speeches, and they read the speeches to the students so that the students could learn how to produce a sophisticated speech or monologue. Socrates, on the contrary, preferred dialogues. So he preferred a teaching method that was based on dialogues. And dialogues are particular because in dialogues, the teacher and the students, they engage together in the search for truth. So you see here that searching for the truth becomes an intellectual shared activity. It's an activity that collectively engages many different people. It's not something that you do in isolation. That's very beautiful, I think. Moreover, it must be said that the Socratic dialogue is not something general, something that applies to everyone. On the contrary, something very flexible, very responsive to the needs of the student's soul. So it is thrown into the situations that the students are living. And that's something very, very important, something that we are going back to. And today we are sort of like starting to appreciating again. But what about the Socratic method? How did Socrates taught his students to self-examine themselves? How did he taught his students to recognize their own ignorance and embark on the process of discovering the truth? Well, the Socratic method has two parts. The first part is the deconstructive or refutatory moment, which is also known as irony, the ironic moment. In this case, during the stage, Socrates leads the interlocutor to confront their own presuppositions of knowledge, and in the end, leads the interlocutor to recognize their own ignorance. Usually, Socrates starts a dialogue by asking the question, what is X? What is this? What is that? What is a something? And that's a very, very important question for Socrates. It's the fundamental question. So you see in the dialogues that Plato wrote that Socrates most of the time is randomly walking around the city and randomly meets a person. And so he starts to talk with the person. At a certain point, very naively, Socrates says, "Oh, I think you know about justice. Can you please tell me about justice?" And so they start to talk about justice. However, the point is that at the beginning, Socrates pretends to accept the interlocutor's definition, let's say, of justice in this case, or the interlocutor's position about justice. But he only pretends to do so because then he starts to ask very probing and challenging questions that gradually reveal all the contradictions that are implied in the answers that the interlocutor gave to Socrates. So you see here that the irony functions as a form of simulated agreement, of a false agreement. Socrates pretends to agree with his interlocutor, but actually he asks questions to them in order to expose what they don't know, what they think they know, but they actually don't know. And so he, in the end, exposes the limitation of their knowledge. Now, I want to read a passage that shows you how uncomfortable this process is and how deep the questions that Socrates made were, and how well they allowed a person to recognize the limitations of their knowledge. So let me read here from the Meno, which is one of the dialogues that Plato wrote. Socrates, here is Meno who is talking. I certainly used to hear, even before meeting you, that you never do anything else that exists in a state of perplexity yourself, and put others in a state of perplexity. And now you seem to me to be bewitching me and dragging me and simply subduing me with incantations, so that I come to be full of perplexity. And you seem to me, if it is even appropriate to make something of a joke, to be altogether, both in looks and in other respects, like the flat torpedo fish of the sea. For indeed, it always makes anyone who approaches and touches it grow numb. And you seem to me now to have done the very sort of thing to me, making me numb. For truly, both in soul and in mouth, I am numb, and I have nothing with which I can answer you. And yet, thousands of times I have made a great many speeches about virtue, and before many people, and done very well, in my opinion anyway. Yet now I'm altogether unable to say what it is. You see here that the topic is actually virtue, and you see here that Mino is recognizing the limits of his knowledge, because he's recognizing that he doesn't know what to say. He doesn't have anything to say about virtue, because everything that he has said was wrong, was actually wrong, or it was deficient. It was not precise. So now he's left in a state of perplexity. He doesn't know what virtue is. And that's where the second part of the dialectic the Socratic method start. That is the constructive stage of the Socratic method. But before we go to the second stage, I just want to say one simple thing, that this refutatory and deconstructive moment was the problem. It was the problem for Socrates. It was due to this moment that Socrates incurred into all of the adversity that he'd incurred into. Because for mediocre people, it is very unsettling, it's very frustrating, it's very challenging to hear that they don't know. So mediocre people don't react well when people tell them that they don't know, that they're ignorant. They feel, oh, he has embarrassed me, she has embarrassed me, they have embarrassed me, so I need to punish them. And you can see here that that's exactly the moment that Socrates was accused of. It is due to this refutatory moment that Socrates got to trial. On the contrary, however, those who genuinely search for virtue, those who are genuinely committed to virtue, see the beneficial aspect of this refutatory stage, of this practice that Socrates is doing, because they recognize that this practice serves as a purification of the soul, because it removes false beliefs and prepares the soul for truth. Okay, so we're ready to start the description of the second stage, which is called the maietics. The second stage involves helping the interlocutor or the students to give birth to their own truths. So in this second stage, after the mind of the students has been liberated, has been freed from all of the false beliefs, now we are ready to sort of like discover the truths that we missed before, that were missed before. But the very particular thing that Socrates does is that he does not try to implant or impose his own beliefs on the students or the interlocutor's mind. He does not try to do that. And that's very, very unique. That it was unique at that time, and it's still unique actually. But what he tries to do is to allow and help the students to discover the truths within themselves. So for Socrates, the point is not to tell students, oh, okay, that's the truth, memorize it, record it, and just save it and cherish it within your soul. No, the point is to embark on a path of discovering together the truth within oneself. And so Socrates here just functions as a guide. He functions as a guide that through asking new, challenging, and probing questions, help the student or the interlocutor to give birth to the truths that are within themselves. And you can see here how important the job of his mother was, because as a midwife gives birth to babies, Socrates gives birth to ideas, help students to give birth to their own ideas. And that's really, really, really important. I want to briefly underline that again. the way in which Socrates allows a student or an interlocutor to give birth to their ideas is through through a dialogue, through the method of questioning and searching for answers. However, it can be the case that sometimes an answer is found and sometimes an answer is not found. But that doesn't matter. Finding the answer is not the most important thing. Embarking on a process of asking questions, that's the most important thing. Yet, I think that's pretty clear, but to better understand what's happening in the Socratic method, let me make an example, which is taken from, of course, one of Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro, where Socrates questions Euthyphro about the topic of piety. So here, the problem is understanding the nature of piety. So let me just briefly read this summary that I've made. Euthyphro initially claims that piety is doing what is loved by the gods. Socrates firstly pretends to accept this definition, but engages with Euthyphro in a careful and persistent questioning process. Through his probing inquiries, Socrates exposes the ambiguities and potential contradiction in Euthyphro's definition, most notably the problem of divine disagreement and the circularity of defining piety solely by what the gods love. So here Socrates shows Euthyphro how defining piety as what the gods love is problematic. Why? Because the gods actually disagree on what is good and what is bad, what is just and what is unjust. And so if we say that being pious is following what the gods love and the gods disagree on what they love, then we see that we can't be pious. Our behavior is going to be very chaotic and confused. Sorry, I just lost the point. Where was I? Okay, so each time Euthyphro offers a refinement of his initial definition, Socrates examines it critically, showing that it either fails to capture the essence of piety or introduces further conceptual difficulties. Socrates, however, does not lecture Euthyphro by giving him the answer. So at a certain point, Euthyphro knows that he's giving all of the wrong definitions about piety, but Socrates does not lecture Euthyphro, saying to him what piety is, but actually guides him to critically assess his own beliefs. He also encourages Euthyphro to self-examine what he knows. By revealing the gaps in his understanding, Euthyphro is prompted to reflect on his assumption and the limits of his knowledge. Nonetheless, the Euthyphro ends the dialogue ends inconclusively, because despite Socrates' relentless questioning and Euthyphro's repeated attempts to redefine the nature of piety, no satisfactory answer or universal definition is reached. This is mainly because at a certain point, Euthyphro gets frustrated. He got frustrated, very frustrated, and he departs. He leaves as Socrates. He makes up an excuse and he just said, I have to leave, and he leaves. You can see here a mediocre people that is not willing to accept a confrontation with a person that shows him his ignorance or the limits of his knowledge. But this dialogue is really important because the fact that it's unresolved, that there's no ending, that no final answer is reached, is actually very important because it shows us that the purpose of the Socratic method and the Socratic elenchus is not to find a final answer, but it's actually to stimulate critical thinking, self-examination, and the recognition of one's own limitation of knowledge, one's own ignorance. As a consequence, or consequently, you can see here that the priority is not on finding answer, but in asking the right kind of questions. Questions are more important than answers. And this dialogue shows this point brilliantly, I must say. And it shows how when we dialogue with one another, when we confront one another, what we should learn from this is to to think critically about what just happened, to self-examine ourselves, and to recognize that we do not know everything, that sometimes there are different perspectives, and these perspectives are really insightful and are really good, they're really brilliant, and we should take them into consideration. So our class ends here. I have talked, and I explained to you who Socrates was. I explained to you his philosophy, and in particular his philosophical method of teaching students to learn self-examination, self-knowledge, and stimulating critical thinking. Now, as you know, it's time for our usual exercise. Thank you so much for your attention.